a guy who's at the absolute center of this, which I can't even imagine trying to deal with a candidacy in this storm, former Kansas Secretary of State and current candidate for Kansas Attorney General, Kris Kobach, who proudly says he's been sued by pretty much every Democrat administration out there. That is definitely a feather in one's cap indeed. Sir, thank you so much for joining us. Good to have you.
Great to be with you, Dana.
Talk to me about the expectation. What are you expecting the result to be? What is Kansas's sentiment? Because Kansas is a very interesting state. This is going to definitely be used as a measure of national sentiment because you all are voting on abortion on August 2nd and how the state's going to handle this. Tell us about it.
Yeah, we're ground zero right now for the abortion debate. There are, I'm a lifelong Kansan, and there are more yard signs that say either vote yes or vote no than I have ever seen in my lifetime on any ballot issue in this state. There's tons of money flowing in from out of state, mostly on the pro-choice side. But there are many Kansans. I would say that our state is a slightly majority pro-life state, more so than the national average, but not so overwhelming that this vote will assuredly go the right way. The issue specifically is that in 2019, the Kansas Supreme Court, which is a very activist, liberal Supreme Court, invented out of thin air a right to an abortion in our 170-year-old Constitution that is even broader than the Roe versus Wade federal constitutional right. And so what has happened is even though Roe v. Wade has been overturned in the federal courts, we still have the state constitutional right in Kansas, which again is not a legitimate decision. So we, the people, are overruling. The legislature proposed a rewording the Kansas Constitution to make clear there is no constitutional right to an abortion, and the legislature retains the right to regulate abortion. And that's all this does. It simply goes to the prior status quo and says the legislature, the people through their legislature, can decide what restrictions we want. Anyway, it is just unbelievable. The pro-choice side is running ads saying that this will end all abortions in Kansas, which that's not what this amendment does. There's a lot of deception going around. And the early voting numbers are breaking all the records for a non-presidential election year. So it indicates that, people are, coming out to vote on this. And of course, my attorney general race is right in the middle of this too, because I'm in a hot attorney general primary. And for me, it's so important because, God willing, if value them both, which is the name of our pro-life amendment, if it passes, job one for me will be to rapidly restore all of our pro-life laws on the books in Kansas that were either overturned or were put in suspended animation by the Kansas Supreme Court's bad decision a couple years ago.
We're talking with Kris Kobach, and Kansas is going to be number one in determining. They're going to be the first state to vote on reproduction. I don't like to say the word reproductive rights because it's not an issue of right. I'm always like the choice is before conception. But I know a lot of states had trigger laws in place. The language that has been used by a lot of the abortion lobbyists saying that, this is going to ban everything, even in instances of women's health. I was watching someone try to lie about Texas and Missouri and a couple of other states as it relates to ectopic pregnancies, which are nowhere in any state at all whatsoever treated as though there's no exception for that because they're not at all, they're not going to be successful pregnancies. Talk to me a little bit about some of the language that's been used because the editorials that I read are that essentially Kansas, there's not going to be any exception at all whatsoever, and that's just the way it is. But there have always been exemptions for whenever, like for ectopic or women's lives or something, the language, they try to conflate it. It's infuriating because it supposes that we are all stupid as it relates to female biology.
Yeah, and the pro-abortion side in this debate they have been the ones distorting what the amendment would do. As I said, all the amendment does is say the legislature is free to regulate. We had a number of pro-life laws which, limited late-term abortions, limited partial dismemberment abortions, very reasonable laws that still had, many exceptions. And all it does is allow us to go back to our legislative representatives and debate what the restrictions should be in Kansas. But the deception is just extraordinary. And, one thing years ago when I was a doctoral student, my thesis was on referendums. And one thing that is clear internationally is when voters are confused, they tend to vote no. They tend to reflexively vote no if they're not sure exactly what the referendum does. And unfortunately, that confusion is being utilized by the pro-choice, pro-abortion side of this debate. So, I think nationally people should look at what's going on in Kansas. We're a red state, but we are not so deep red that issues like this couldn't go either way. And the polling indicates it's probably going to be very close.
We're talking with Kris Kobach, who is candidate for AG in Kansas. It doesn't, to me, it speaks of a level of, just looking at this very, very politically, it speaks of a level of irresponsibility from the left and from abortion lobbyists and Democrats, because everyone knew the state was coming with Dobbs. Everyone knew if it wasn't Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health, it was going to be one case that challenged the logic on which Roe v. Wade was predicated. I mean, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was warning people of this for the last 8 years. And it seemed that no one took the precaution on that party's side. No one took the steps, maybe get something ready in your state legislatures. No one did that. I mean, why isn't, I'm just curious as to what your thoughts are on that, because it seems like yelling at people like you and others, that's not really where they should be shifting their blame. They should be asking their party leaders in state by state why they didn't take these precautions.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think it's a reflection of a larger fact, and that is that the left, including the pro-abortion left, knows that at the end of the day, they're going to have a tough, except in far left legislatures like California, New York, but most of the country, they are going to have a hard time arguing for opening up abortions, making abortion more available in more circumstances. Most Americans, when polled on this, think there should be significant limitations on when and under what circumstances a person can terminate a baby's life in an abortion. And that's why they've put all of their chips on the judicial battle. Right. So they just thought that if they keep fighting in the courts and keep getting the courts to invent things out of thin air, then they will win. But now they can no longer win in that anti-democratic sphere where you just win by persuading some judges who are already activist and leaning your way. Now they're going to have to use the force of their ideas, the force of their arguments in state legislatures. And I think the pro-abortion folks know they are probably going to lose in all but the most left states.
And it's very hard. You bring up a really good point. It's very hard for these lobbyists to convince people of taxpayer-funded abortion on demand for recreational purposes. It's very, very hard to convince people of something like that. So they always take, and the Gumacher Institute, that's Planned Parenthood's own, little analysis think tank. They even say that it's less than 1% of all cases where it's or 0.5 rape and incest, respectively. So they're using something that's, such a low number to push this universe. That makes it very hard for them to argue that case. I wanted to tie this in with some of the. I was reading this headline, and of course, I'm sure you've seen them as well. This comes from Kansas.com, and there's a couple of other papers in Kansas City where they say that abortion opponents, I love how it's always that, abortion opponents push to remove ballot drop boxes ahead of Kansas amendment vote. So everyone's now talking about apparently these ballot boxes. They're saying that pro-lifers are engaged in false voter fraud conspiracy theories to pressure local officials in restricting voting access. The way that I understand it is that people just want to make sure there's no unattended random ballot box somewhere in a street corner where there's no oversight as to who's dropping what in there when.
That's exactly right. And Kansas has 105 counties. In virtually every county, there has been very easy early voting in a 20-day period leading up to August 2nd. So the idea that you need a ballot drop box that is unattended by anyone, when you could just walk in the door of the county clerk's office and cast your ballot where there are real human beings, to check your photo ID, it's ludicrous. The ballot drop boxes are not necessary. When we have so many easy avenues to vote beforehand, in addition to voting on election day. So you're right. The press always mischaracterizes it, and then whenever they say voter fraud, they say false claims of voter fraud. And I can tell you, as former Secretary of State of Kansas, I successfully prosecuted more than a dozen cases of voter fraud, because Kansas is the one state where the Secretary of State enjoys prosecutorial authority along with county prosecutors. So even in a state with extensive protections like ours, voter fraud always appears, and sometimes in small numbers here, sometimes in huge numbers in places like Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I'm always amazed at people who say, oh, it really doesn't exist. I had people who were illegally registered to vote at my home address, and I had to fight with the Board of Elections here in Texas just to take care of that. So to have people try to argue that it doesn't exist, we know it does. We've seen it. Kris Kobach,
Yeah.
we appreciate your fight for truth and life, and we're going to be watching to see what happens on August 2nd. A lot of that's gonna have some waves for sure.
Yeah, for sure. And if people want to keep up with the race, they can check out my website at kriskobach.com, Kriskobach.com.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, sir. We'll be watching. Take care.